The old Victorian house stood on a gentle rise overlooking the town, its darkened windows like vacant eyes staring into the perpetual twilight of the New England landscape. It had stood there for generations, its timbers groaning under the weight of countless storms and the secrets they bore. They called it the Blackwood House, a name whispered in hushed tones by the locals, a name that evoked a primal fear. The house was not just old, it was steeped in a darkness that seemed to seep from the very earth it was built upon. The first family, the Harringtons, 1903. The Harringtons arrived in the spring of 1903, a young family full of hope and dreams. Thomas, a scholar with a thirst for the quiet life, his wife, Elena, a gentle soul with eyes full of warmth, and their daughter, 8-year-old Lily, a vibrant spirit who found wonder in every corner of the world. They had come seeking solace, escaping the clamor of city life, unaware that they were stepping into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. The first few weeks were idyllic. Lily spent her days exploring the overgrown gardens, her laughter echoing through the aged trees, while Thomas immersed himself in his studies in the grand library, its shelves filled with ancient tomes. Elena, with her graceful touch, slowly transformed the neglected rooms into a haven of domestic comfort. But as the days grew shorter, a subtle unease crept into their lives. It began with fleeting shadows in their peripheral vision, the feeling of being watched, even when they were alone. The house seemed to sigh in the dead of night, its wooden bones creaking in ways that felt more sentient than structural. One evening, Lily came to dinner with an unusual mark on her wrist, a mark like a dried, gnarled root. She didn't remember getting it. Thomas tried to rationalize it, suggesting it might be a bramble scratch, but Elena looked at him with a disquieted expression. As the weeks turned to months, the unnerving occurrences escalated. Doors would slam shut with no wind, objects would move from one place to another, and there were whispered sounds from behind the walls that seemed to mock and menace. Thomas found it hard to focus on his work. The shadows in the house seemed to take on distinct forms, and the books in the library felt cold to the touch, their words seeming to writhe before his eyes. He thought he was imagining things, a product of the house's pervasive gloom. Elena suffered nightmares of a woman with eyes like smoldering coals, a face etched with ancient malevolence, who called her name in a voice that seemed to burrow into her very soul. The true horror began on the eve of Halloween, a night when the veil between worlds was said to be thinnest. Lily had been playing in the attic, a place she was told not to go, fascinated by the dusty trunks and forgotten artifacts. In the late afternoon, as the sun cast long, ominous shadows, the little girl went silent. Thomas and Elena called her, their voices growing panicked, but there was no response. Finally, they found her at the far end of the attic, in a corner they had never previously explored. Lily was staring into an old, open chest, eyes wide with terror, her small body unmoving. Thomas tried to shake her, but it was clear that she wasn't breathing. Her body was cold as ice, a strange network of roots and vines having wrapped themselves around her limbs, twisting and constricting her. Her face had contorted into a mask of frozen horror. The unimaginable had happened. Their vibrant, beloved daughter was gone. The Harringtons had unwittingly triggered the malevolence that dwelt beneath the house. The death of Lily shattered what little sanity remained in the couple. Thomas plunged into a deep despair. He spent most of his time in the library, poring over his books and trying to find some explanation, some escape from the reality of what had happened. The volumes seemed to whisper secrets, a chorus of dark incantations that swirled around him, blurring the line between the real and the unreal. He began seeing things out of the corner of his eyes, grotesque faces in the grain of the wood, and the books seemed to shift and writhe, their pages filled with horrifying symbols he couldn't comprehend. He started muttering, his mind succumbing to a chilling spiral. Elena, who had always been a beacon of hope and love, began to exhibit erratic behavior. The woman with the smoldering eyes in her nightmares seemed to be bleeding into her waking life. Elena would often wander the house at night, mumbling to herself, her eyes wide with a terrifying awareness that Thomas could not understand. She would trace the root-like markings that appeared on her skin, as if she had become an extension of the house. Her grief morphed into something twisted, something that felt more monstrous than maternal. One night, Thomas awoke to a strange chanting coming from the basement, a place he had always avoided, the cold earth of the foundations repelling him. He followed the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. He found Elena in the middle of a macabre ritual, surrounded by a circle of flickering candles, the root-like markings on her skin glowing with an eerie light. She was murmuring in an ancient tongue, her face contorted in a sinister smile, a wicked and knowing glint in her eyes. Before he could react, she turned to him, no trace of his beloved Elena in the terrifying gaze that locked with his. The entity that had been awakened was far more powerful than he could have imagined. The house itself seemed to breathe, the walls pressing in, the floorboards groaning like tortured souls, and he understood, with terrifying certainty, that they were both trapped in Beezel's realm. The entity seized them, using their grief and brokenness to weave a tapestry of despair, binding them forever to the malevolence that dwelled beneath the foundations of their home. Thomas was the first to break, his mind shattered, his soul ripped to shreds by the unfathomable horrors that had been unleashed. He took his own life in the library, his body discovered days later, a silent testament to the darkness that had consumed him. Elena was never found, her essence and soul a tool of the entity that had claimed her. The second family. The Carters, 1943. 40 years later, the house stood silent, its secrets still buried deep within its heart. The town had mostly forgotten the Harringtons, their fate fading into the realm of local law, a cautionary tale. Then came the Carters in 1943, a family seemingly destined to repeat the tragic cycle. Edward, a doctor escaping the ghosts of the war, his wife, Margaret, a nurse with a pragmatic mind, and their son, 10-year-old Daniel, a quiet boy with an intense gaze. They believed that they could bring new life into the old house, unaware that they were walking directly into the clutches of Beezel. The first sign was the cold. An unnatural cold that settled into the bones, no matter how many fires they built or how many layers they wore. Then came the whispers, more pronounced this time, weaving themselves through the very air of the house. Edward, with his scientific mind, tried to rationalize it, dismissing it as a draft or old timbers settling, but the unease in his heart grew stronger with each passing day. Margaret, with her pragmatic nature, tried to maintain order, but the house felt like it was unraveling around them. Daniel, a sensitive child, seemed to be the most attuned, his eyes often fixated on unseen things. He would spend hours staring into empty corners, talking to the shadows, whispering names that seemed to both frighten and fascinate him. The occurrences escalated more rapidly for the Carters. Daniel began having nightmares of a dark, twisted figure emerging from beneath the house, a figure with roots for limbs and malice in its heart. He started to draw strange, unsettling symbols, the same ones that Thomas had seen in his books 40 years before, the same symbols that now seemed to be etched into the woodwork itself. The symbols felt old, ancient, and alive. They seemed to writhe, almost as if they were feeding off the cold and the fear that permeated the house. Edward started to experience periods of confusion and paranoia. He would misplace his medical instruments, sometimes finding them rearranged into grotesque patterns, and he had the sensation that he was being watched. Margaret found herself drawn to the attic, her mind becoming preoccupied with the idea of finding something lost, something forgotten. She found her own reflection in the dusty mirror, with root-like markings on her skin and a look in her eyes that seemed alien and disturbing. The horror intensified when, one evening, Daniel disappeared. His parents searched the house, their voices growing more desperate with every passing minute. They found him in the basement, the same basement that had terrified Thomas Harrington. He was staring at a dark stain on the floor, his eyes wide, a chilling silence surrounding him. This time, however, Daniel wasn't dead. Instead, he had become an empty vessel, his personality replaced with an uncanny calm. He started to speak in an old, guttural tongue, reciting ancient incantations that were beyond his understanding. The boy was no longer their child, he was the entity's puppet. Edward, desperate to reclaim his son, tried to use his medical skills, but all of his instruments seemed useless, turning to dull, useless metal in his hands. Margaret, torn between her maternal instincts and a deep, horrifying sense of terror, was pulled deeper into the darkness. She felt drawn to the basement, to the cold, earthy smell, and to the disturbing silence that was now a constant presence. The roots that had first appeared on her face were spreading rapidly now, her mind succumbing to a twisted devotion to the entity that resided beneath the house. The malevolence of Beezel had ensnared them, the family succumbing to a madness deeper than the Harringtons, their wills crushed, their minds twisted beyond repair. Edward, once a man of science and reason, began to see the world through a distorted lens, the house itself having become an extension of his own warped consciousness. He tried to fight, but his efforts were useless against the ancient power that held them in its grip. Margaret, now fully consumed by the darkness, became a willing acolyte, her maternal instincts twisted into a horrifying devotion to Beezel, her own son now a vessel of evil. Edward finally succumbed, his sanity shattered, his body discovered by neighbors who had become worried by his increasingly erratic behavior. His death was not a release. Instead, it was a continuation, his soul and being now a part of the darkness that pervaded the house. Margaret was gone from the house, the local authorities assuming she fled. No one ever saw her again. Daniel, a hollow husk of his former self, simply vanished from the house. He was a testament to the power of Beezel, a vessel used and discarded. The third family, the Millers, 1973. 30 years later, in 1973, the house again found new occupants. The Millers were a modern family, a product of a more cynical age. David, a pragmatic engineer who scoffed at the local legends, his wife, Sarah, an artist with a penchant for the unusual, and their teenage daughter, Emily, a rebellious soul who believed that there was something beyond the mundane. They had come to the house, not seeking escape, but seeing it as a fixer-upper project, an artistic challenge. They were ready to embrace the challenge, not knowing that the challenge would embrace them in turn. Initially, the Millers were unfazed by the stories of the previous families. David, with his engineering mind, approached the house as a structural problem to be solved, ignoring the unsettling aura that seemed to surround it. Sarah, inspired by the atmosphere of the house, saw it as the perfect subject for her art, unaware that the darkness of the place might end up painting her, just like the house itself. Emily, drawn to the house's rebellious spirit, felt like she was finally home. However, the house was not something to be easily ignored. The first sign was the feeling of being watched. Sarah started to see her art taking on disturbing shapes, colors, and symbols, even before she had touched the canvas. Her paintings took on a life of their own, depicting scenes of ancient rituals and distorted faces. David started hearing the whispers, at first indistinct and barely audible. They grew louder and more menacing, especially at night, making it hard for him to sleep. Emily, fascinated by the stories she had heard from the locals, started to feel a pull, an obsession, with the basement, as if she was being drawn to something she knew was there, yet couldn't explain. The occurrences began to escalate quickly. David discovered hidden rooms within the house, their walls covered with the same root-like symbols and ancient writings that had consumed his predecessors. He started to feel his mind slipping, the house seeming to distort his senses, turning the logical into the impossible. Sarah's paintings became increasingly disturbing. They began to bleed and move, the figures within them seeming to stare at her. Emily started to spend most of her time in the basement, her fascination with it turning into something deeper, something more dangerous, as she started to communicate with the malevolent entity that dwelled beneath the house. One day, Sarah discovered Emily in the attic, standing before a dusty old chest that seemed to hum with a dark energy. The chest was the same one that had claimed Lily Harrington so many years ago, and the same one that had tormented Margaret Carter. Emily turned to her, her eyes vacant, her voice a cold whisper of an ancient tongue. She had become a vessel, just as Daniel had all those years ago, the entity's pawn. Sarah, desperate to save her daughter, tried to reach the woman she remembered, but Emily had become something else entirely. David, witnessing this horror, finally understood that the house was not just a structure, it was a living entity, and that they were all trapped within its grasp. He had built a rational world, and had no defense against the ancient evil that had taken residence in his home. The entity's power grew, feeding off their fear and desperation, its roots deepening into their minds. Sarah, in a desperate act of defiance, tried to destroy her paintings, but they only multiplied, spreading the darkness into every corner of the house, the images now staring from the walls, ceilings, and floors. David tried to escape to get help, but the house wouldn't let him. He found himself turning back, drawn by an unseen force that seemed to compel him forward. The Millers fell victim to the same fate as the families before them, their sanity ripped to shreds, their souls consumed by the entity. David's body was discovered by the neighbors, his face contorted in a silent scream, but it was what was not there that brought real fear. Sarah and Emily were never seen again, consumed by the house and the darkness that lay beneath. They became part of the house, their essence joining the chorus of souls trapped by Beezel. The house remains. The Blackwood House still stands today, on that gentle rise, overlooking the town. It is abandoned now, its windows dark and vacant, but its history is a silent presence, a chilling reminder of the darkness that dwells beneath. The locals still whisper of the house, their voices hushed with a primal fear, and they warn against going anywhere near it. The old Victorian house waits, its heart beating to an ancient rhythm, waiting for the next unsuspecting family, and hoping to feed its eternal hunger. Beezel and her twisted realm remain, patiently waiting beneath the earth, forever bound to the house, an ageless witch, with roots deep in the earth, her influence a malevolent force, forever entwined with a cursed home. The cycle of tragedy will continue, as long as the house still stands, as long as the earth itself remembers the evil that was awakened there.